Zhang Shi's earliest memories were of a village nestled in the northern reaches of the Song Dynasty, where the sprawling fields met the jagged hills in the distance. It was a place where time seemed to stretch and bend with the rhythm of the seasons. Her home was a modest one, a thatched-roof cottage with walls made from timber and clay, and an ever-present smell of rice cooking over a small fire. The life of a farmer's daughter wasn't one of luxury, but it was steady and familiar. The cycle of sowing, tending, and harvesting provided a sense of order to the days. Yet, Zhang Shi had always felt that she was destined for something greater than the life her family led, though she could not yet articulate what that was. Her father, Zhang Liang, was a man of simple means but profound wisdom, a former scholar. He had once studied the Confucian classics, though circumstances had driven him to leave the scholar's robe behind in favor of a plow and a hoe. He could no longer afford to continue his studies, but the words of the ancient texts stayed with him, guiding him in the cultivation of not just rice and grain, but the minds of his children. Zhang Shi's mother, Zhao Wen, was a quiet woman, but her actions spoke volumes. Person of deep resolve. She spent her days managing the household and keeping a watchful eye on the children. She never questioned the course her life had taken, but she raised Zhang Shi to understand that there was a world beyond their village, a world that, someday, she might be called upon to engage with. From an early age, Zhang Shi had exhibited an insatiable curiosity. While the other children played in the fields or ran to the market, she would spend hours sitting with her father, listening intently as he recited passages from the classics or discussed the intricacies of politics and governance. He never intended for her to become a scholar in the traditional sense. His dreams had always been for her to marry well, to bring honor to the family through her choice of a husband. But Zhang Shi was different. Her heart was filled with questions about the world, about the way things were governed, and about how societies were shaped. She would often ask her father, "Why do the rulers of the land have so much power, and yet the people seem so burdened?" Her father would respond, "Power, my daughter, is a dangerous thing. It is not the rulers who should be feared, but the way they wield it." By the age of 16, Zhang Shi had grown into a young woman of uncommon grace. She was not the most beautiful in her village, but her quiet intelligence and calm demeanor made her a striking figure. Her hair, dark and thick, cascaded down her back in waves, and her eyes, deep and thoughtful, revealed the careful calculation of someone who had lived through a lifetime of observations. Even if those experiences had been small in scale, it was during this time that her father began to speak to her about the importance of marriage, of finding a man who could provide for her, protect her, and, most importantly, understand the ideas she held so dear. But it was not her father's words that shaped her future, but rather the events that would unfold in the capital city of Kaifeng, where the imperial court lay, shimmering with the weight of history and power. A letter came to the village, delivered by a government official with an air of importance that caught Zhang Shi's attention. The letter was an invitation to the local families, asking for young women of good repute to attend the civil examination being held in the capital. It was an opportunity, albeit rare, for a woman to catch the eye of a potential suitor from the higher echelons of society, a man who could offer much more than the simple life of the village. Zhang Shi's parents, both practical and cautious, saw this invitation not as a chance for glory but as a potential path to a more comfortable life. Yet, Zhang Shi could not help but feel a strange sense of destiny. To go to Kaifeng, to see the heart of the Song Dynasty, was a thought that filled her with a sense of purpose. She would meet the men of the court, yes, but more than that, she would witness firsthand the complex world of governance, of policy, and the intellectual currents that flowed through the land. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might find the man who would change her life forever. The journey to Kaifeng was long and arduous. Zhang Shi and her parents traveled by cart, winding their way through fields, over rivers, and through the bustling towns that dotted the landscape. Along the way, she saw the contrasting realities of the empire, the grandiosity of the imperial city and the struggles of the rural farmers who, like her family, lived under the shadow of taxation and inequity. It was here, amidst the throngs of people, that Zhang Shi first caught sight of a young man who would change the course of her life forever. He was standing at the edge of a small market square, a quiet figure amongst a crowd of courtiers and scholars, his eyes focused on the scrolls in his hands. Wang Anshi was not yet the famous statesman that history would remember, but already there was something about him, an intensity, a determination that set him apart from the others. Zhang Shi's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than she intended, and in that brief moment, their eyes met. It was as though the world paused, and in that instant, Zhang Shi felt an undeniable pull, a sense that, in some inexplicable way, their fates were now intertwined. Wang Anshi was a scholar, but he was more than that. He was already beginning to form ideas about how the world could be improved, how the empire could be reformed to address the growing disparities between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the powerless. He had a mind that was restless, always seeking answers to questions that others had yet to ask. Zhang Shi, in her quiet way, understood the depth of his intellect and the fire in his soul. And though neither of them knew it then, that fleeting moment of recognition marked the beginning of a journey that would take them both to the heights of power and to the depths of personal sacrifice. As the days passed and Zhang Shi settled into the rhythm of court life, she found herself drawn into the conversations that surrounded her. The men and women who had come from all corners of the empire were discussing the affairs of the state, the latest edicts from the emperor, and the future of the dynasty. But it was the quiet moments, the ones she shared with Wang Anshi, that left the deepest impression on her heart. There, in the shadows of the grand halls, they spoke of ideals of justice, of equity, and of a vision for a better world. It was in these conversations that Zhang Shi began to see the potential of a man who was not merely a scholar, but a visionary, a man who might one day change the very fabric of the Song Dynasty. And so, in the bustle of the imperial city, amid the clash of old and new, Zhang Shi's life began to take a turn that would carry her far beyond the quiet village where she had grown up. She could no longer ignore the whispers of fate, and as her relationship with Wang Anshi deepened, so too did her understanding of the role she would play in his journey and in the future of the empire. It was the beginning of a partnership that would shape the course of history, even if neither of them yet knew the full weight of the path ahead. The days that followed their first encounter were filled with an uneasy but inevitable pull between Zhang Shi and Wang Anshi. The initial spark, fleeting as it had been in that crowded market square, soon transformed into something more tangible, something deeper. Both of them, having come from different worlds, were now bound by a shared sense of purpose that transcended mere attraction. For Wang Anshi, Zhang Shi was not just a young woman of beauty and intellect. She was a mirror to his own dreams of reform, of breaking away from the old ways of thinking. And for Zhang Shi, Wang Anshi was not simply the ambitious scholar she had first met. He was someone who spoke to her heart, someone whose ideals resonated with the desires she had always felt but never quite understood. Yet, as their relationship blossomed, so did the complexities of their respective lives. Zhang Shi, now a part of the imperial world in Kaifeng, was constantly reminded of the weight of expectations placed upon her as a woman. Her father had raised her to be intelligent, well-spoken, and self-assured, but even he could not prepare her for the intricacies of court life. Women in the Song Dynasty, particularly those from families of modest means, were expected to remain in the background, their roles limited to domestic duties, marriage, and bearing children. Yet, Zhang Shi's keen mind could not accept such constraints. She longed to do more, to contribute to something greater than the confines of her household. Wang Anshi, for his part, was gradually making his way through the ranks of the imperial bureaucracy, his intellect and bold ideas beginning to attract attention. His views on reform, however, were radical in the eyes of the conservative factions within the court. He sought to strengthen the empire by redistributing wealth, imposing new taxes, and revamping the military. To many of his peers, his proposals were dangerously progressive, a challenge to the established order that had kept the elite in power for centuries. For Zhang Shi, watching Wang's rise was both exhilarating and terrifying. His passion for reform and justice was undeniable, but the forces of resistance were formidable. In those quiet moments when they were alone, she could see the weight of his ambitions pressing down on him, a burden he carried with quiet dignity. It was during these early years of their marriage that Zhang Shi began to understand just how high the stakes were, and how deeply she was now entangled in his vision for a new China. Their wedding had been a simple affair, a ceremony marked more by the solemnity of tradition than by any extravagant display of wealth or power. The union was arranged by their families, as was customary, but it had been Zhang Shi's quiet insistence that made her parents agree to the match. She had seen something in Wang Anshi that transcended the superficiality of wealth and status, and so their lives together began with mutual respect. Though the future was anything but certain, she had left behind her simple life in the countryside, and now, as the wife of a rising scholar in the court, she was expected to navigate a world of intrigue, power plays, and fragile alliances. For Wang, the demands of court life were both intoxicating and suffocating. He had quickly garnered the attention of key figures in the imperial government with his bold ideas, but it was clear that not everyone shared his vision. His proposals to overhaul the tax system, redistribute land to the poor, and strengthen the central government faced fierce opposition from entrenched elites who feared losing their privileges. These men, many of them powerful landowners and military commanders, saw Wang's ideas as a threat to the status quo, and they used every tool at their disposal to undermine his influence. It was a game of political chess, one where even the smallest misstep could result in ruin. Despite the pressures, Wang remained steadfast. It was this unwavering determination that Zhang Shi admired most in him. He was, as always, consumed by his ideas, by the belief that only radical change could save the empire from corruption and collapse. She, however, saw the toll it was taking on him. There were days when he would return from the court exhausted, his face drawn, his eyes clouded with frustration. During these times, Zhang Shi was his only solace. She knew when to offer advice and when to remain silent, when to challenge his thinking and when to simply listen. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the court, Wang returned home late. He had been embroiled in a fierce debate over his proposed reforms with some of the most powerful ministers in the court. They had mocked him, calling his ideas fantastical, impractical. Even his closest allies had begun to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their own positions in support of his vision. Zhang Shi, sensing the depth of his frustration, did not ask him about the details of the argument. Instead, she simply poured him a cup of tea, the steam rising gently as she handed it to him. He took the cup from her, his hand trembling slightly, and sighed deeply. "I have no allies left, Zhang. The reform I dream of is slipping away. The court is riddled with corruption, and the people, the ones I am trying to help, are caught between two warring factions, the ruling elite and those who seek only to line their own pockets." His voice was raw, betraying the exhaustion that weighed on him. Zhang Shi sat beside him, her presence offering him a rare moment of peace. She reached out and placed a hand on his, grounding him. "You are not alone," she said softly, her voice steady. "I am here with you, and I will always stand by your side." Her words, simple as they were, seemed to cut through the heaviness of the moment. Wang turned to look at her, his gaze softening. "And what of you, Zhang Shi? Do you believe in my cause? Do you understand what it will take to make this empire better?" Zhang Shi took a deep breath before responding. "I believe in you, and yes, I understand that change comes at a cost. But I also know that without it, the empire will falter. I am not the scholar you are, But I see the injustice around us, the way the poor are treated, the way the powerful grow fatter while the people suffer. It is not right." Wang smiled at her words, though the smile was tinged with sadness. "You always see things clearly, don't you?" he murmured. "Sometimes, I wonder if the weight of my ambition is too much. Perhaps it is not meant to be." Zhang Shi shook her head. "The greatest battles are the hardest fought, my love, but together, we will see this through." This simple exchange marked a turning point in their marriage. No longer just partners in life, they became partners in a cause that would come to define the rest of their lives. Wang's reforms began to take shape more clearly in his mind, and Zhang Shi became his closest confidant. She helped him refine his ideas, offered her insights, and provided the emotional strength he needed to keep going. They were, in many ways, inseparable. However, as the years passed and Wang Anshi's reforms began to take root, their lives were marked by increasing tension. Though his vision for a more equitable society resonated with the lower classes and some progressive officials, it was vehemently opposed by the old guard. His push for the new policies, which aimed to centralize the government, increase state control over the economy, and overhaul the military, created deep divides within the court. His enemies were not just powerful, they were also relentless. Their machinations were subtle and devious, and even those closest to him began to waver. Zhang Shi could see the strain these political battles were placing on Wang. He had become a figure of increasing importance, and thus increasing danger within the imperial court. She, too, began to feel the pressure. As Wang's influence grew, so did the scrutiny on their personal lives. Gossip spread like wildfire, and the whispers of her involvement in her husband's reforms grew louder. The court, it seemed, could not tolerate the idea of a woman influencing politics, especially a woman of her humble background. For Zhang Shi, these pressures came not only from outside but from within her own home. Her growing role as Wang's confidant and advisor was both empowering and isolating. While she stood beside him with unwavering loyalty, the cost of such loyalty became ever more apparent. One night, after a particularly heated session at court, Wang returned home to find Zhang Shi sitting by the window, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. He could tell by the look on her face that something was weighing heavily on her mind. "Zhang Shi, what is it?" he asked softly. As he joined her by the window, she hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice laced with a quiet concern. "Wang, the road ahead is not easy. I see the growing enmity toward you, and I fear for our future. You are pushing against forces that are too powerful to ignore." He met her gaze, his expression solemn. "I know the risks, my love, but the people need these reforms. The empire needs them. I cannot turn back now." Zhang Shi nodded slowly, understanding the fire that burned within him. "I do not want you to turn back," she said, her voice firm, "but we must be prepared for what is to come." And so, as the years wore on, the couple became ever more entangled in the struggle for reform. The challenges they faced were monumental, and the stakes could not have been higher. Their love, their vision, and their determination would be tested to their limits in the years that followed. But together, they would face the storms that loomed on the horizon. The years following Wang Anshi's formal ascent to power saw both triumph and tribulation. The ambitious reforms that he had fought so hard to implement, his new policies were beginning to take root across the empire. But with success came great resistance. The court was sharply divided. Those who supported his vision were buoyed by the promise of a more centralized, equitable society. But the old guard, with its entrenched wealth and power, rallied against him at every turn. Zhang Shi, as always, stood by her husband's side. But as the stakes grew higher, so too did the toll of this loyalty. The political games at the court had become more vicious, and the threat of betrayal loomed large. She could feel it in the air, the subtle whispers, the glances exchanged behind closed doors, the shifting allegiances. Her own role in Wang Anshi's rise was not immune to scrutiny, and in a court where power was wielded like a sword, even the most innocuous gesture could be seen as a challenge. Wang's enemies grew bolder with time. The conservative factions, led by powerful ministers and military leaders, were now openly critical of his policies. They accused him of undermining the imperial authority, of threatening the status quo that had sustained the empire for centuries. The land tax reforms he had initiated, which aimed to alleviate the burden on farmers while redistributing resources more evenly, were seen as a direct affront to the aristocracy. The Greenwood Army, a militia he had established to bolster state control over rural areas, was viewed with deep suspicion by the military elite, who saw it as a threat to their own power. Every victory for Wang in the imperial court was met with a counterattack from his foes. The imperial secretariat, traditionally a conservative body, was now a battlefield. The reformers rallied around Wang, but they were growing weary. Wang Anshi, the man who had once seemed unstoppable, was beginning to feel the weight of his own ideals. He no longer slept through the night as he once had. He no longer spoke of the future with the same fiery conviction. The political struggle had taken its toll on his health, his spirit, and, most painfully, his marriage. Zhang Shi could see the changes in him. He was still the man she had married, the one who had burned with the desire to change the world. But now there was an underlying sadness in his eyes, the unrelenting pressure of opposition, the constant threat of political ruin, was beginning to erode his confidence. There were days when he would retreat into himself, pacing the rooms of their home late into the night, his brow furrowed in deep thought, and Zhang Shi could do nothing but watch. One such night, when the oppressive heat of summer had made the walls of their home stifling, Zhang Shi found Wang staring out of the window. The light from the oil lamps flickered faintly across his face, casting shadows that seemed to emphasize the fatigue etched into his features. "Wang," she said gently, stepping into the room, "you've been at this for hours. You need to rest." He didn't turn to look at her immediately, but she could tell he was listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "Rest? There is no rest, Zhang Shi. Not while the empire teeters on the edge of collapse." Zhang Shi walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more for this country than anyone else ever could. You've given them hope." Wang turned then, his gaze meeting hers. "And yet it feels like I am fighting a losing battle. The more I push for reform, the more the old powers push back. I am surrounded on all sides by enemies, both within and outside of the court. And the people, they don't understand. They see the policies that are meant to save them as burdens instead. The farmers who were supposed to benefit from the new land taxes are angry. The military resents the loss of their power. And the court is divided, torn apart by greed and corruption." His words, though honest, carried a bitterness that Zhang Shi had never heard from him before. "You knew it would be hard," she reminded him, though her voice faltered slightly. "You knew the path would not be easy, but you mustn't let the weight of their opposition break you. You mustn't let it break us." Wang looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "How can I keep going when the very people I am trying to save turn their backs on me?" Zhang Shi's hand tightened on his shoulder, a gesture of both strength and tenderness. "Because you are not alone. You have me, you have your vision, and most importantly, you have the people who still believe in you. The empire is vast, and not all of it is corrupted." Wang closed his eyes, taking a long breath. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only slightly. Zhang Shi's words had rekindled something in him, a spark of hope, however faint. But there was no denying the reality that they now faced. Their enemies were formidable, and every victory came at a cost. As the months passed, the political situation grew more tense. The new policies had begun to show results in some areas, particularly in the central regions of the empire, where the land tax reforms were easing the burden on the poor. However, in the southern provinces, where the old power structures were more entrenched. Resistance remained fierce. The tension between the reformers and the conservatives in the court reached a boiling point. At times, it felt like the empire itself was on the verge of a civil war. In the midst of this turmoil, Zhang Shi's role began to evolve. While she had always been a sounding board for Wang's ideas, now she found herself more actively engaged in the political discourse of the court. Her keen intellect and quiet strength made her a valuable ally to Wang, but it also made her a target for those who sought to discredit him. Rumors began to circulate that she was more than just a supportive wife, that she was, in fact, the true power behind Wang's reforms. Some called her a puppet master. Others saw her as a dangerous influence on her husband's decisions. For Zhang Shi, these accusations were nothing more than the desperation of those who feared the changes that Wang was trying to bring. She knew that her position in the court was fragile, but she also knew that she had a responsibility to stand by her husband, to support his vision even when it seemed the entire world was against him. Yet, despite her efforts to remain steadfast, the strain of the situation was beginning to take its toll on her as well. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, but the political maneuvering in the court was unlike anything she had ever anticipated. The pressure was suffocating, and she began to question the choices they had made, the path they had chosen. Was it worth the risk? Was it worth the pain? Her thoughts were interrupted one morning when a messenger arrived at their home, bearing news that would change everything. The messenger handed Wang a letter, sealed with the imperial seal. He broke it open and read it quickly, his face growing pale as he absorbed its contents. Zhang Shi watched him closely, her heart sinking as she saw the look of dread settle over his features. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying her concern. Wang looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "The emperor has called for an imperial investigation into the new policies. They are questioning my actions. They believe I have overstepped my bounds." Zhang Shi's stomach twisted. The emperor's approval had always been tenuous at best. But this was different. An investigation could spell the end of everything they had worked for. "We cannot let them turn this into a trial," Zhang Shi said, her voice urgent. "You cannot stand alone in this." Wang nodded slowly, though the weight of the situation was clearly overwhelming him. "I don't know if I can fight this, Zhang. Not when the emperor himself is turning against me." Zhang Shi took his hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. "Then we will fight together." In that moment, a new resolve hardened within her. She had stood by Wang through every trial so far, and now, more than ever, she would fight for the future they had worked so hard to build. They could not allow the forces of corruption and fear to tear apart the dream of a better empire. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. The letter that arrived that fateful morning was the first domino to fall in a series of events that would alter the course of Wang Anshi's reform efforts forever. The emperor's call for an imperial investigation was more than a simple challenge to his policies. It was an open declaration of war against everything Wang had worked for. The court, already divided between reformers and conservatives, now found itself in a precarious balance, teetering dangerously on the edge of chaos. The old guard saw this as their moment, an opportunity to dismantle Wang's reforms and restore the empire to its former state of complacency and privilege. But what they did not understand was that the true battle was no longer just about policies. It was about the survival of an idea that had begun to take root deep within the hearts of the people. Zhang Shi stood by Wang through this darkest hour, but even her unwavering loyalty was beginning to strain under the weight of the storm that was coming. In the days following the emperor's decree, the atmosphere at court became suffocating. Ministers, once allies, now turned their backs. Whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Among the reformers, there were those who began to question whether the cost of change was too great, whether they had gone too far in challenging the very foundations of the empire. The imperial investigation was thorough, a meticulous search for any evidence of corruption or misconduct in Wang Anshi's policies. It was a process designed not to uncover truth, but to cast doubt, to discredit Wang's opponents, led by the powerful chancellor. Su Shi seized upon any misstep, no matter how small, and used it as ammunition to tarnish his reputation. The emperor, who had once been a reluctant supporter of Wang's reforms, now wavered, his mind clouded by the pressure from both sides. The old aristocracy, sensing an opportunity to reclaim their lost influence, poured their resources into attacking Wang's credibility, both in the court and among the public. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure weighed heavily on Wang. His nights were sleepless, filled with the dread of an impending downfall, while the days were spent dodging enemies in the court, trying to rally his supporters, and defending his policies. His once unshakable resolve now faltered, and Zhang Shi could see it. The man who had once spoken of reform with fire in his eyes, who had dreamed of a better China, was now a shadow of that man, a man torn between his vision and the harsh reality of his enemies. One night, as the weight of the investigation hung over them like a storm cloud, Zhang Shi entered the study to find Wang hunched over a desk, papers scattered around him. His face was pale, his expression one of profound exhaustion. The deep lines around his eyes were more pronounced than ever, and his usually sharp gaze seemed clouded with doubt. "Wang, you've been at this for hours," Zhang Shi said softly, her voice filled with concern. "You need to rest." He didn't immediately respond, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. It wasn't until she moved closer, her hand gently touching his arm, that he finally looked up. "I can't, Zhang. The court is closing in on me. The emperor has summoned me for a private audience tomorrow. I don't know what he wants, but I fear it may be the end." Zhang Shi's heart clenched at his words. She had seen him face countless challenges, but this was different. The future of their reforms, and perhaps even their safety, was at stake. She sat beside him, her presence a calming balm in the midst of the storm. "You have fought for the people, Wang," she said, her voice firm, but gentle. "You cannot let them take away what you've built, what we've built together. You have given your heart to this cause, and there are those who will stand by you." Wang's eyes softened as he turned to her. "I don't know if I can win this fight anymore. The forces against us are too strong. I fear that even if I prevail, it will be at too great a cost." Zhang Shi shook her head, taking his hand in hers. "You have always known that change does not come easily, and you have never shied away from the cost of what is right. If you must face the emperor tomorrow, then do so with the knowledge that you have my support, no matter what happens." He sighed deeply, a mix of gratitude and sorrow in his expression. "I don't know what I would do without you, Zhang Shi. You are the only one who has truly understood me, who has believed in this dream alongside me." She smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "And I always will. You are not alone." The next day, Wang Anshi was summoned to the imperial palace for his audience with the emperor. Zhang Shi, as was customary, remained behind, waiting anxiously in their quarters. The palace, once a place of triumph, now felt like a prison. It was not just the political intrigue that threatened to tear them apart, but the overwhelming uncertainty of what the future held. As she paced the room, Zhang Shi found herself reflecting on the choices they had made, on the sacrifices they had both endured for the sake of a vision that seemed to be slipping away. When Wang returned hours later, he looked even more weary than before. His face was drawn, and his eyes, once filled with determination, now seemed clouded with defeat. "How did it go?" Zhang Shi asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Wang lowered himself into a chair, rubbing his temples. "The emperor is wavering. He has agreed to allow the investigation to continue, but he is no longer certain that my policies are the right path forward. The conservatives have convinced him that my reforms are destabilizing the empire. He is afraid that the cost of change will outweigh the benefits." Zhang Shi took a deep breath, trying to process his words. But you can still convince him, can't you? You can show him that what you've done is necessary, that the empire needs these reforms to survive. Wang shook his head slowly. I don't know. The emperor is weak, torn between the old guard and the forces of change. He wants to do the right thing, but he is afraid. The court has poisoned his mind against me. Zhang Shi's heart sank, but she refused to let despair take hold. Then we will have to fight in other ways, she said, her voice steady with resolve. We will rally those who still believe in your vision. We will take the fight to the people. Wang looked at her, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. The people? Yes, Zhang Shi said, standing tall. The people may not have the power of the court, but they have the power of numbers. They have the power of their voices, and they have seen the benefits of your reforms. If we can convince them to stand with us, they can be the force that tips the scales in our favor. Her words were a balm to his weary soul, a reminder of why they had fought so hard to get this far. The power of the people was a force that could not be underestimated. And if the court refused to listen, then perhaps the voices of the people could make the emperor hear. And so, as Wang Anshi prepared for the next phase of the struggle, the political maneuvering that would shape the future of the Song Dynasty, Zhang Shi remained by his side, her resolve as unshakable as ever. They would face this battle together, no matter what it cost them, because the dream of a better China, a more just and equitable empire, was worth any sacrifice. As the days stretched into weeks, the political atmosphere at court grew increasingly hostile. The emperor, unable to maintain a steady hand amid the surging tides of dissent, found himself in the grip of those who sought to undo the work Wang Anshi had so carefully built. The investigation into Wang's reforms was no longer a mere inquiry. It had become a weapon, a tool to dismantle everything he had worked for. With each passing day, the power of the conservatives in the court swelled, and with it, the pressure on Wang and Zhang Shi. The people, once hopeful that the changes would bring relief, now found themselves divided. In the cities, there was still a lingering hope that the new policies would bear fruit, especially in the reform of land taxes and the distribution of wealth. But in the countryside, where many had borne the brunt of the changes, frustration simmered. Farmers, burdened by the expectations of the new taxes and the land redistribution, began to voice their displeasure. The Greenwood Army, which had once been heralded as a force for maintaining order, now faced increased resistance from the very people it had been sent to protect. Rumors of uprisings in the rural regions spread like wildfire, stoking the flames of discontent. Wang Anshi could feel the weight of this unrest more keenly with each passing day. The emperor's wavering stance made it difficult to predict the future. Even within his own circle, doubts began to creep in. The reformers who had once stood by his side now questioned the wisdom of his course. His advisors, his closest allies, began to distance themselves, wary of being dragged down with him if the winds of change turned too violently. Despite this, Zhang Shi remained resolute. Her unwavering belief in Wang's vision was a constant anchor in the storm that raged around them. She knew that the course they had set was fraught with peril, but she also knew that to abandon it now would be to lose everything they had fought for. The reforms had been designed to benefit the people, to right the wrongs that had plagued the empire for centuries. She had seen the potential for change with her own eyes, and she refused to let it slip away without a fight. One night, as Wang pored over reports from the province's discussions of uprisings, dissenting voices in the court, and the increasing number of spies working against him, Zhang Shi sat beside him, silently watching him. She had come to realize just how much of the burden of their reforms he carried alone. The weight of leadership was often unbearable, and it was clear that his health was deteriorating under the strain. His face had grown gaunter, and his once lustrous hair had begun to show signs of early graying. Yet, despite the toll it was taking on him, there was still a fire in his eyes, though it flickered more weakly with each passing day. "Wang," she said, her voice soft yet insistent. "You cannot do this alone. We must rally the people. You must show them that your vision is not just for the court, but for the future of the entire empire." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with fatigue. "Zhang Shi, you don't understand. The people have turned against me. They've heard the lies spread by the conservatives. They've seen the uprisings in the countryside and the discontent among the soldiers. They think I am a tyrant, a man who would sacrifice their lives for a dream that is impossible." Zhang Shi shook her head, her gaze fierce. "You cannot believe that. The people may be confused, but they are not fools. They see what the old aristocracy wants, to keep them in poverty and despair. They see your reforms as a promise for a better life, a life where they are not forgotten. We must remind them of that." For a moment, there was silence between them. Wang's shoulders slumped, and his eyes drifted toward the papers scattered on the desk. But Zhang Shi could see that her words had made an impact. There was a flicker of the old resolve in him, a spark that had not yet been extinguished. Still, the weight of his doubt hung heavily in the air. "You are right," he said at last, though his voice was tinged with a weariness that spoke volumes. "But I don't know if it's enough. The forces against us are growing stronger. The conservatives are pushing harder. They are even stirring unrest among the generals, convincing them that I am leading the empire to ruin." Zhang Shi stood and walked toward the window, gazing out at the courtyard below. The moonlight bathed the space in silver, and for a moment, she found solace in the quiet beauty of the night. But even as she stared into the stillness, she knew that their time was running out. "We have no choice but to fight," she said, turning back to him. "We must take the message to the people. We must give them something to believe in, and we must show the emperor that we will not back down." Wang sighed deeply. "You ask so much of me, Zhang Shi, but I know you are right. I have fought for this dream for too long to let it slip away without a final stand. I will not go quietly into the night." In the days that followed, Wang Anshi and Zhang Shi began to strategize. They knew that the time for diplomacy and subtlety had passed. The conservatives had closed their ears to reason, and the emperor was too frightened to act decisively. If the reforms were to survive, they would have to turn to the people, those who had once placed their trust in Wang and his vision of a more just and equitable society. They sent emissaries to the provinces, rallying support among the farmers, the merchants, and even some of the soldiers who had once been skeptical of Wang's policies but who had seen the benefits in their own lives. Zhang Shi worked tirelessly behind the scenes, crafting speeches and letters that would reignite the flame of hope in the hearts of the common people. She knew that their only hope lay in uniting them under a common cause, to defend the reforms that had the potential to transform their lives. But the political winds were shifting against them. As the unrest in the countryside continued to grow, whispers of rebellion began to echo through the imperial palace. The generals, once loyal to Wang's cause, were now leaning toward the conservatives, fearing that the reforms had destabilized the empire. It was a dangerous moment for Wang and Zhang Shi, for even as they sought to rally the masses, they were confronted by the real possibility of armed resistance from within the very institutions they had once relied upon. One evening, as Wang prepared to deliver a speech to the people, a last attempt to sway public opinion, Zhang Shi could sense the gravity of the situation. They both knew that this speech would be their final chance to rally support, to turn the tide before the forces of opposition overwhelmed them. If the people did not respond, they would be left with no allies. And if that happened, the dream of a reformed empire might very well come to an end. "Zhang Shi," Wang said quietly, as they prepared for the speech, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if they will listen." She placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady and confident. "They will listen, Wang. They trust you, and they will follow you if you show them that your vision is not just a dream, but a reality they can believe in." For a moment, Wang's gaze softened, and he nodded. There was a steely resolve in his eyes as he looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. "We will see," he said, his voice determined. The city of Kaifeng, once a gleaming jewel of imperial splendor, now stood at the brink of a new chapter in history. Beneath the towering gates of the imperial palace, whispers of rebellion filled the air, while the streets were alive with the restless murmurs of a divided populace. The emperor, Yuanzong, had withdrawn to his private chambers, surrounded by a group of advisors whose loyalty was uncertain at best. The reformers, once hopeful that the tides of change would sweep through the empire, now found themselves cornered by the very forces they had sought to reform. In the midst of the growing chaos, Wang Anshi stood firm, his resolve strengthened by the unwavering support of Zhang Shi. The tension that hung over them like a storm cloud was undeniable. Their plans had reached a critical juncture. The emperor's indifference, his inability to see the potential for change, had pushed Wang to the edge. What had begun as a quiet movement to reform the empire was now a battle for survival, both for Wang's legacy and for the vision of a more equitable future. Zhang Shi, ever steadfast, remained by his side, while Wang had always been the visionary, the driving force behind the reforms. It was Zhang Shi who provided the grounding, the strength that allowed him to continue despite the mounting pressure. As she paced through their private quarters, preparing the final speeches and communications for the assembly, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The final confrontation with the emperor and the conservative factions would take place in mere hours, and with it, the fate of their reforms and of their dreams would be decided. The summons from the emperor had come at dawn. Wang Anshi had known it was coming, but the gravity of the moment still weighed heavily upon him. The emperor's summons was not a call for dialogue. It was a command, an ultimatum. He had summoned Wang to the palace under the pretense of offering a chance for reconciliation. But Wang knew that the emperor had already made his mind up. The emperor was no longer the ally he had once been. The conservative faction had poisoned his thoughts, and the murmurs of dissent had drowned out the voice of reason. Zhang Shi accompanied Wang as they made their way to the imperial palace. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere in the streets a reflection of the conflict brewing in the court. Outside the palace gates, the tension was palpable, with groups of reformist sympathizers gathering, their faces filled with hope and fear in equal measure. The soldiers, whose allegiance remained uncertain, stood guard, but their eyes flickered with doubt as they watched the procession. Inside the imperial court, the mood was somber, with the most powerful men in the empire sitting in their customary places. The high-ranking officials, the ministers of the old guard, stood like silent sentinels, their eyes cold and calculating. Among them was Su Shi, the arch-conservative, who had made no secret of his disdain for Wang's reforms. His piercing gaze followed Wang as he entered, a subtle but unmistakable sign of the battle that was about to unfold. The emperor sat on his golden throne, his face a mask of indecision. Behind him stood his advisors, who whispered in his ear like vultures. Wang knew that this was not the emperor he had once worked with, the emperor who had supported his vision of reform, who had seen the potential for change in the empire. No, this was a man surrounded by fear, afraid of losing his grip on power, afraid of the chaos that reform would bring. Wang Anshi, the emperor began, his voice flat, almost disinterested. You have led the people astray with your ideas. The empire is in turmoil. The reforms you have introduced have caused widespread unrest. The soldiers are disillusioned, the peasants are revolting, and the aristocracy is in open rebellion. You have destabilized the empire. Wang Angshi's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but the sting of betrayal still cut deeply. He had devoted his life to this cause, and now, here he was, standing before the very man he had hoped would champion his reforms, only to be condemned as a failure. Your Majesty, Wang replied, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of conviction. It is true that change is difficult, but I did not seek to destabilize the empire. I sought to heal it. The old ways are no longer sufficient. The people are suffering under the weight of corruption, poverty, and inequality. My reforms were meant to uplift them, to create a system where the rich and powerful no longer hold all the resources while the common people toil in the fields without hope. The emperor's face hardened. Enough of your rhetoric, Wang. The old ways may have their faults, but they are the foundation of the empire. Without them, we risk losing everything. The aristocracy is in revolt. They demand your head, and the military generals, who once followed you, now see you as a threat to the stability of the empire. Wang's chest tightened at the emperor's words. He knew what this meant. His reforms had become a threat not just to the old aristocracy, but to the very structure of power that had kept the Song Dynasty in place for centuries. The emperor, in his fear and indecision, had turned against him, and now, it seemed, there was no turning back. As the conversation unfolded within the walls of the imperial court, outside, the people were beginning to stir. They had not been idle while the palace debated their future. Zhang Shi, ever the strategist, had sent word to the cities, to the towns and villages, to the farthest corners of the empire. Word of Wang's reforms had spread, and with it, the hope of a better future. Farmers, merchants, scholars, and even some disillusioned soldiers had begun to gather outside the gates of the palace, demanding their voices be heard. The reformists, once a small faction, now found themselves the voice of a burgeoning movement. Zhang Shi knew that their only chance for survival lay in the support of the people. If they could convince the emperor that the people were behind them, perhaps they could sway his decision. But this would not be an easy task. The conservative faction had a stranglehold on the court, and the emperor, it seemed, was already lost to them. At the gates of the palace, the crowds grew larger by the hour. They chanted for justice, for reform, for a future free from the tyranny of the old aristocracy. Among them were those who had seen their lives improve under Wang's policies, the farmers who had received better treatment from the government, the merchants who had benefited from the new tax regulations, and the scholars who had been given opportunities to contribute to the betterment of society. But the crowds were also a sign of the unrest that had spread throughout the empire. The disillusioned soldiers, the farmers who had suffered from the new taxes, the people who had been promised too much and received too little. Each group had their own reasons for standing outside the palace, demanding change. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary. It was whether the emperor would listen to the voices of his people or ignore them in favor of the powerful elite. Back in the imperial court, the tension reached its peak. Su Shi rose to speak, his voice dripping with venom. Your Majesty, if you continue to support this man, the empire will fall. The people are unruly, and the soldiers will not fight for a man who threatens the stability of our great nation. The time has come to remove Wang Anshi from power before it is too late. Zhang Shi, who had been standing silently in the shadows of the hall, suddenly stepped forward. Her presence was commanding, her gaze unwavering. Your Majesty, she began, her voice strong, the people have already spoken. You cannot ignore them any longer. The reforms have brought them hope, something that the aristocracy has failed to do for generations. If you choose to ignore their will, you risk losing not only their trust but the future of the empire itself. Her words were a shock to those present, but they rang true in the hearts of those who had hoped for change. The emperor's eyes flickered momentarily. He had always known that his people, the common people, had been yearning for a chance to rise from their oppression. But the court had blinded him to their needs, filled his ears with the poison of those who feared change. As the debate raged on, outside the palace gates, the voices of the people grew louder. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for action had come. The final hours were upon them. The crowds outside the imperial palace had reached a fever pitch. The streets were teeming with those who had come from far and wide, their faces marked with hope and desperation. Word had spread that the emperor was about to make a decision that would change the course of history. Would he support the reforms that had begun to take root under Wang Anshi? Or would he bow to the pressures of the conservative factions that surrounded him? Inside the palace, the tension was unbearable. The emperor had retreated further into his private chambers, torn between the counsel of his advisors and the overwhelming voice of the people. The conservative faction, led by Su Shi, had warned him that supporting the reforms would spell disaster for his reign. Yet, outside the gates, the cries of the common people were impossible to ignore. They were the heartbeat of the empire, and they demanded to be heard. Wang Anshi and Zhang Shi stood together in the inner halls of the palace, waiting for the moment that would decide their future. Their hearts were heavy, knowing that no matter what decision the emperor made, the consequences would be far-reaching. This was not just about their reforms anymore, it was about the future of the Song Dynasty, the destiny of the empire itself. After hours of deliberation, the emperor finally emerged from his chambers. His face, once so full of youthful ambition, now seemed weary, burdened by the weight of his choices. He glanced at the gathered officials, who stood in silence, awaiting his decision. "Enough," the emperor said, his voice quiet yet firm. "The time for debate is over. I have listened to all of you, but it is clear to me now that we are at a crossroads. The old ways have failed. The aristocracy that surrounds me has been blinded by their own greed and desire for power. They have forgotten what it means to serve the people." A murmur of shock rippled through the court. No one expected such a declaration from an emperor who had been so closely aligned with the old guard. But in that moment, the emperor's eyes met Wang Anshi's, and for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of the man who had once championed reform. "I cannot allow this empire to fall into the hands of those who would see it stagnate. Wang Anshi, I will stand by you. Let us see your reforms through." The decision was made. A collective breath was released across the court. Wang Anshi, though deeply moved, maintained his composure. He had won, but the victory felt bittersweet. The people had triumphed not through brute force, but through their unwavering belief in the need for change. Zhang Shi, standing at his side, could feel the tension in the air dissipating, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. She had always believed in the vision that Wang had articulated, but to see the emperor finally side with them felt like a victory not only for Wang but for the future of the entire empire. She turned to him, her eyes filled with both relief and pride. "You did it," she whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion. Wang nodded, but his gaze never left the emperor. He knew that this victory was only the beginning. The reforms had been accepted at the highest level, but the real work would be in ensuring they were implemented properly, that the changes would reach every corner of the empire and truly benefit the people. In the days that followed, a series of new decrees were issued by the emperor, officially endorsing the continuation of Wang Anshi's reforms. The land tax system was overhauled, the state-run grain stores were expanded, and military service was reorganized to ensure a more just and equitable distribution of resources. The People's Court was established as a means to provide common citizens with a voice in local governance. The first steps toward a more inclusive society were taken, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of cautious optimism among the common people. However, the victory was not without its consequences. The conservative factions did not simply accept the emperor's decision. Su Shi and his allies were not finished yet, and there were whispers of a counter-revolution, of plots to undermine the reforms from within. There were even reports of discontent within the military ranks, some generals refusing to follow the new orders. The empire was not yet fully reconciled, and the battle for the soul of the Song Dynasty was far from over. Wang Anshi, aware of these challenges, continued his work tirelessly. He toured the provinces, speaking to the people, ensuring that the reforms were being implemented with fairness and consistency. But he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. His health, already fragile from years of stress, began to deteriorate further. He was aging, and the burden of his reforms weighed on him like a stone. Yet, he was resolute, for the sake of the empire and for the people he had fought so hard for. He would continue. Through it all, Zhang Shi remained by Wang's side. She had never been a mere supporter of his vision. She had always been a crucial partner in the implementation of those ideas. Her intellect, political savvy, and unflinching belief in the reforms had been the driving force behind much of the groundwork for the changes that had taken place. She had been his sounding board, his advisor, and his confidant. But now, with Wang's health declining and the situation growing more precarious, Zhang Shi found herself taking on an even more prominent role. As Wang's strength waned, she took on more responsibility in managing the administrative side of the reforms. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the people's voice remained heard, that the system of checks and balances Wang had worked so hard to put in place was functioning as intended. Her greatest challenge, however, was to keep the spirit of the reforms alive in a court that had already begun to grow restless. There were those who had initially supported Wang but who now looked to undermine his legacy. In the face of this, Zhang Shi remained unyielding. She knew that the future of the reforms and the future of the empire depended on their ability to endure, to be more than just a fleeting moment in history. Years passed, and while Wang Anshi's health continued to deteriorate, the reforms he had initiated began to take root. Though the conservative factions never fully accepted the changes, the reforms had undeniably shifted the course of the empire. The common people, for the first time in centuries, had a real stake in the empire's future. They were no longer mere subjects of an oppressive system but active participants in the governance of their land. Wang Anshi died quietly in his sleep, his life's work incomplete but undeniably impactful. He had not seen the full fruits of his labor, but the foundations were laid. The seeds of change had been planted, and while the empire was still far from perfect, it was on a path that had never been possible before. The reforms had altered the trajectory of the Song Dynasty and set the stage for a future that would be shaped by the ideals of justice, equality, and opportunity. Zhang Shi, now a revered figure in her own right, continued to serve the empire for many years. She oversaw the continuation of Wang's policies and worked to ensure that the reforms remained true to their original intent. She became a symbol of resilience, wisdom, and determination, guiding the empire through turbulent times. In the end, the legacy of Wang Anshi and Zhang Shi was not defined by the immediate results of their reforms, but by the lasting influence of their vision. They had changed the way the Song Dynasty viewed governance and the role of the people in shaping their own destiny. Through their efforts, the empire had taken its first steps toward a more just and equitable society. Their names lived on in the annals of history, not as conquerors or kings, but as reformers, as visionaries who dared to dream of a better future, and who, despite the odds, brought that dream to life.